On a stormy night, Megan clutched a flashlight in one hand, her heart pounding as her German shepherd, Shadow, growled low and steady by her side. Outside, a sleek black car sat parked across the street, its headlights off, its silhouette barely visible under the flicker of lightning. Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass pierced the air, followed by the unmistakable rattle of her front door handle. What the intruder didn't know was that the terrified, scarred shelter dog he had abandoned months ago had transformed into a protector and was about to confront him in a way no one expected. The metal cage was cold and unforgiving, much like the world Shadow had come to know. The large German shepherd curled into a tight ball in the farthest corner, his once proud stature reduced to a hunched shadow of fear. His scars, thin white lines crisscrossing his dark coat, were a roadmap of pain, each one a story of survival in a life no one cared to know. He didn't bark like the other dogs. Barking didn't matter. It didn't bring visitors to his cage. It didn't save him from being passed over for the younger, happier dogs whose wagging tails and excited yips filled the shelter with false hope. Shadow simply lay there, his dull eyes staring blankly ahead, waiting for the inevitable. The shelter was overcrowded, and dogs like Shadow, large, scarred, and labeled as aggressive, rarely made it out alive. The staff whispered in hushed tones that his time was up. Tomorrow, they decided, there wasn't enough space, and Shadow was deemed unfit for adoption. Across town, Megan sat in her tiny apartment, scrolling through her phone with a heavy heart. As a vet tech, she had spent years helping animals, but the emotional toll of losing her last rescue dog, Max, had left her questioning whether she could do it again. She missed the warmth of a furry companion, but couldn't shake the fear of failing another dog. Her thumb hovered over a social media post, a grainy photo of a German shepherd lying motionless in his cage. The caption read, "Shadow, 4 years old. Time runs out tomorrow." Megan stared at the image, her chest tightening. There was something haunting in his eyes, a resignation she had seen too many times before. Her logical side whispered all the reasons why she couldn't adopt: her long hours, her small apartment, her lingering grief over Max. But the tiny flicker of hope in Shadow's gaze, faint as it was, wouldn't let her scroll past. Without thinking, Megan dialed the shelter. "Hi, I'm calling about the dog in your post. Shadow, please don't do anything until I come by tomorrow." The next morning, Megan stood outside the shelter, her nerves a tangled mess. The building was unassuming, a simple brick structure surrounded by chain-link fences. But the weight of what was inside made it feel like a fortress. "Are you sure about this?" Karen, the shelter manager, asked as she led Megan down the corridor. "Shadow isn't an easy dog. Well, let's just say he has a history." "I'm sure," Megan replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. When they reached Shadow's cage, Megan's breath caught. He was even more defeated in person than he had seemed in the photo. His large frame was curled tightly in the corner, his head resting on his paws. He didn't even glance up at her, as if he had long since given up on humans. Karen opened the cage cautiously, keeping her movements slow. "He's not exactly welcoming," she warned. Megan crouched down, her voice soft. "Hey, Shadow," she said gently. "It's okay, boy. I'm not here to hurt you." Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but he didn't move. Megan extended her hand, careful not to invade his space. After a long, tense moment, Shadow lifted his head slightly, his dull eyes meeting hers for the first time. "I'm here to take you home," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Shadow didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark, but he didn't flinch either. And in that small act of trust, Megan saw the tiniest glimmer of hope. The ride home was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the soft rustle of Shadow shifting uneasily on the blanket Megan had laid out for him. His large frame curled into the smallest possible space, his body stiff, his eyes flicking between the window and Megan as if trying to decide whether this new reality could be trusted. Megan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her heart aching at the sight of the defeated dog who seemed more shadow than substance. She wanted to say something comforting, but words felt inadequate for the magnitude of his pain. When they arrived, Shadow hesitated at the threshold of Megan's modest apartment, his paws firmly planted on the doormat as if crossing the line into a new life was too much to bear. Megan knelt down, speaking softly. "It's okay, Shadow. This is home now. You're safe here." After a long pause, he took a tentative step inside, his ears twitching at the unfamiliar sounds of the creaking floorboards and the faint hum of the refrigerator. He sniffed the air cautiously, his movements low and deliberate, before retreating to a corner near the door. There, he curled up into a tight ball, his body a fortress of fear, his eyes fixed on Megan. Megan gave him space, knowing that trust wouldn't come overnight. She placed a bowl of water nearby, quietly setting up the dog bed and toys she had bought the night before. It was a simple home, but she had prepared it with love, hoping it would be enough to help Shadow start healing. Over the next few days, a delicate routine began to take shape. Shadow remained in his corner, his movements minimal and his posture tense. But Megan never pushed him. She spent hours sitting on the floor near him, reading a book or working on her laptop, allowing her presence to become a part of his environment. Slowly, the fortress he had built around himself began to show cracks. One evening, as Megan sat cross-legged on the floor sorting through some papers, she felt a soft nudge against her knee. She froze, her breath catching. Shadow had approached her, his nose gently brushing against her leg as if testing the waters of trust. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached out, her hand hovering above his head before resting gently on his fur. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice trembling. It was a small moment, but for Megan, it felt monumental, a silent promise that they were in this together. But just as the first glimmers of trust began to shine through, a shadow from Shadow's past loomed closer. Late one evening, Megan noticed a car parked across the street. It was unremarkable at first glance, a plain black sedan with tinted windows, but something about its presence felt off. It didn't belong to any of her neighbors, and it had been there for hours. Shadow seemed to sense it too. He stood by the window, his ears perked, his growl low and steady, his body tense as if preparing for a fight. Megan's unease grew as the nights passed, and the car returned. One evening, she finally worked up the courage to step outside and confront whoever was inside. But as soon as she approached, the engine roared to life, and the car sped off into the darkness. It left behind only a chilling sense of foreboding that settled in her chest like a stone. Determined to protect Shadow and herself, Megan called the shelter to ask about Shadow's past. Karen, the shelter manager, hesitated before speaking. "We don't know much," she admitted. "But there were whispers. Shadow might have been part of a dogfighting ring. We're not sure, but his scars and behavior match the profile. It's possible someone's looking for him." Megan's blood ran cold. The thought of Shadow enduring such cruelty made her heart ache. But the idea that someone might be hunting him down was even more terrifying. She resolved to be vigilant, locking her doors and windows each night and keeping Shadow close. But one stormy evening, as lightning illuminated the sky and rain lashed against the windows, Megan's worst fear became reality. The sound of shattering glass pierced the air, followed by the unmistakable rattle of the front door handle. Shadow sprang to his feet, his growl turning into a ferocious bark that seemed to shake the very walls of the apartment. Megan's hands trembled as she grabbed her phone, dialing the police while clutching a flashlight in the other. The intruder didn't expect what awaited him on the other side of the door. Shadow, the dog once abandoned and broken, now stood as a fierce protector, his teeth bared and his body braced. When the door finally gave way, Shadow lunged, forcing the man to retreat into the rain-soaked night. Megan shouted, her voice steady despite her fear. "The police are on their way. Leave now." Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and the intruder disappeared into the darkness. Shadow remained by Megan's side, his growls softening as she knelt to hug him, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're my hero." As the adrenaline faded, Megan sat with Shadow, stroking his fur as the storm raged outside. She looked into his eyes and saw not just fear, but strength and loyalty, a testament to the power of second chances. Before I share what happened next, let me take a moment to connect with all of you, my incredible viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever felt that unbreakable bond with an animal, hit the like button, because Shadow's story is proof that love and trust can transform even the darkest past into something extraordinary. This was just the beginning of Shadow's transformation. What he would do next would not only change his life but inspire an entire community to believe in the power of redemption. Stay tuned, because the best is yet to come. The storm passed, but the unease lingered. The next morning, Megan sat by the window with a cup of coffee in hand, watching Shadow as he rested near her feet. His head lay on his paws, his ears twitching at every distant sound, and his eyes remained fixed on the door as though expecting the intruder to return. Megan's heart ached as she stroked his fur, whispering softly, "You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." But deep down, she knew the danger wasn't over. Later that day, Megan received a call from Karen at the shelter. "I thought you should know," Karen began cautiously. "We had someone call this morning asking about Shadow. They were insistent, wanted to know if we'd rehomed him. Of course, I didn't tell them anything, but it felt strange." Megan's stomach tightened. Someone was looking for Shadow, and it wasn't out of concern for his well-being. The pieces began to fall into place. The mysterious car, the break-in, and now this call. Whoever Shadow had escaped from wasn't willing to let him go. Determined to find answers, Megan spent the afternoon researching the grim world of dogfighting. The scars on Shadow's body, his fear of loud noises, and his defensive behavior all pointed to a past filled with brutality. But one detail stood out. Dogs who survived these rings were often marked with tattoos or branding as identifiers. That evening, Megan gently coaxed Shadow onto his side and examined him closely. Her heart sank as she found it. A faint but unmistakable tattoo on his inner thigh. The markings were crude but clear enough to confirm what she feared. Shadow had been part of an operation that saw dogs as nothing more than tools of violence and profit. The discovery brought both clarity and urgency. Megan realized that whoever had come for Shadow likely wanted to recapture him for the same cruel purposes. She couldn't let that happen. But how could she protect him when the shadows of his past were closing in? Over the next few days, Megan took precautions. She reached out to local authorities, sharing the details of the break-in and the suspicious calls. The police promised to increase patrols in her neighborhood, but Megan knew she couldn't rely on them alone. She also contacted a friend who worked with animal advocacy groups, hoping to uncover more about the tattoo and the people behind it. Meanwhile, Shadow seemed to sense the tension. His once timid nature began to shift, replaced by a quiet vigilance. He stayed close to Megan at all times, his ears constantly alert and his eyes scanning their surroundings. The bond between them deepened as they leaned on each other for comfort and strength. One night, Megan sat cross-legged on the floor with a folder of documents spread out in front of her. She had spent hours poring over reports of dogfighting rings, hoping to find a connection to Shadow's past. Shadow lay nearby, his head resting on her lap. His body finally relaxed after days of heightened alertness. As she flipped through another report, something caught her eye. A news article about a raid on a dogfighting operation 6 months earlier in a neighboring state. The article described how several dogs had been rescued, but many were unaccounted for. The name of the ringleader was listed: Vince Callahan, a man who had been arrested but released on bail while awaiting trial. The name sent a chill down Megan's spine. Could Vince be the man in the car? Was he trying to reclaim Shadow to silence a loose end? The pieces fit too well to ignore. But the questions swirled in her mind like a storm. What was Vince planning? How far would he go to get Shadow back? And most importantly, how could Megan ensure that Shadow's past would never catch up to him again? The answers were out there, but finding them would come at a price. Megan knew she had to act quickly, but little did she realize that the choices she was about to make would lead to a confrontation that would change everything. For her, for Shadow, and for the man who thought he could take them down. What would happen when Megan came face to face with the man who had nearly destroyed Shadow's life? How would Shadow respond when the past he'd tried so hard to escape returned with a vengeance? The truth would soon come to light, but the cost of uncovering it might be more than Megan bargained for. The next morning, Megan's resolve hardened. She packed a small bag with essentials, loaded Shadow into the car, and drove out of town. The destination was a secluded property owned by her old friend, Ellie, who worked with rescue animals. Ellie had offered her quiet farmhouse as a temporary refuge when Megan first confided her fears. Now, it seemed like the only safe place left. The drive was long and winding, the rural roads cutting through dense forests and open fields. Shadow lay in the back seat, his eyes flicking between the scenery and Megan, as if sensing that this journey was important. Megan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "We'll be okay, Shadow. Just a little further, and we'll figure out what to do." Ellie greeted them warmly, her face etched with concern as she helped Megan carry her things inside. The farmhouse was tucked away at the edge of a sprawling meadow, surrounded by towering oaks and pine trees. It was a haven of peace, far removed from the tension that had consumed Megan's life in recent weeks. Shadow sniffed the air cautiously, his posture still guarded but less tense than before. Ellie knelt to his level, her tone soft and inviting. "You're safe here, boy. No one's going to hurt you." The days at the farmhouse brought a sense of calm that Megan hadn't felt in weeks. Shadow began to relax, exploring the open spaces and even venturing into the meadow with Megan by his side. She watched as he sniffed wildflowers, his tail wagging faintly for the first time since she had brought him home. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental, a glimpse of the life he deserved. But the peace was short-lived. On the third evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the farmhouse glowed with warm light, Megan's phone buzzed. It was a message from the detective she had contacted earlier. "We've identified the tattoo. It matches a ring linked to Vince Callahan. Be careful. He's known for tracking down loose ends." Megan's blood ran cold. Vince was closer than she had thought, and the safety she had found at Ellie's farmhouse suddenly felt fragile. She shared the news with Ellie, who immediately sprang into action. "We need to alert the authorities. If he's after Shadow, he won't stop until he finds him." That night, as Megan tried to sleep, Shadow's low growl pulled her from her uneasy rest. She sat up, her heart pounding, and followed his gaze to the window. In the darkness, she saw the faint glow of headlights cutting through the trees. A car was parked at the edge of the property, its silhouette barely visible under the moonlight. Ellie appeared in the doorway, holding a phone in one hand and a flashlight in the other. "I've called the police. They're on their way, but we need to stay alert." Megan nodded, her adrenaline surging as she grabbed a sturdy walking stick from the corner of the room. Shadow stood by her side, his body tense and ready. Minutes felt like hours as they watched the car. The tension in the room was palpable, each creak of the farmhouse amplified by the silence of the night. Then, the sound of footsteps on gravel broke through the stillness. Shadow's growl deepened, his body rigid as he positioned himself in front of Megan. The intruder moved closer, the faint beam of a flashlight sweeping across the windows. Megan gripped the walking stick tightly, her breath shallow as she whispered, "Stay with me, Shadow." The sound of the front door handle rattling sent chills down her spine, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Then, like a bolt of lightning, Shadow sprang into action. He charged toward the door, barking ferociously, his powerful frame slamming against it. The noise startled the intruder, who stumbled back, his flashlight dropping to the ground. Megan could hear him cursing under his breath as he scrambled to regain his footing. Ellie, holding her ground, shouted through the door. "The police are on their way. Leave now, or you'll regret it." But the intruder wasn't retreating. He fumbled for something in his pocket, a set of lockpicks glinting in the moonlight. Shadow's barking grew louder, more aggressive, and Megan realized they couldn't wait for help to arrive. She flung open the door just as the man reached for the lock, her voice firm and unwavering. "Get away from us!" Shadow lunged, his powerful presence forcing the man to step back. In the chaos, the man dropped the lockpicks and turned to flee, his shadowy figure disappearing into the trees as the distant sound of sirens grew louder. When the police arrived, Megan relayed everything she had witnessed. The officers promised to increase patrols in the area and urged her to consider relocating again. As the commotion died down, Megan sat on the porch, her hands trembling as she stroked Shadow's fur. He leaned into her touch, his eyes soft but alert, as if to say, "I've got your back." The questions in Megan's mind were relentless. Why had Vince come so far to reclaim Shadow? What was he so desperate to hide? And how could she ensure that this brave dog, who had already endured so much, would finally have the peace he deserved? The confrontation had bought them time. But Megan knew it wasn't over. The shadows of Shadow's past were still looming, and the fight for his freedom was just beginning. The farmhouse was quiet the next morning, but the air was heavy with unease. Megan sipped her coffee on the porch, her eyes scanning the tree line where the intruder had disappeared the night before. Shadow lay at her feet, his body relaxed for the first time in hours, though his ears still flicked at every sound. Ellie joined her, holding a steaming mug of tea, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "We need to do more than just wait for the police," Ellie said, her voice steady. "Vince isn't going to stop. And I don't think Shadow's story ends with him running for the rest of his life." Megan nodded, the weight of Ellie's words settling over her. She had spent the past few weeks trying to shield Shadow from the world. But now she realized that wasn't enough. If Vince was desperate enough to track them down, he wouldn't give up until he got what he wanted or was stopped for good. "Then we need to find out exactly what he wants," Megan replied. "And we need proof to ensure he can never hurt Shadow or any other dog again." Ellie's face brightened with a flicker of resolve. "I might know someone who can help. There's a journalist, Claire Bennett, who's been investigating dogfighting rings for years. She's exposed operations like Vince's before. If we tell her what we know, she might be able to dig deeper." By noon, Megan was on the phone with Claire, recounting everything from Shadow's adoption to the break-in at her apartment and the recent confrontation. Claire listened intently, her tone sharp and focused. "If Vince Callahan is involved, there's a trail somewhere," she said. "These operations don't exist in isolation. They rely on networks, funding, and people who think they're untouchable. If we can connect the dots, we can bring him down." Shadow watched as Megan paced the room, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. Claire promised to meet them at the farmhouse the next day, bringing with her a file of evidence she had already compiled on Vince and his associates. Megan hung up, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since the ordeal had begun. When Claire arrived, she was every bit as confident and driven as Megan had imagined. She spread out photos, documents, and maps on Ellie's kitchen table, explaining how Vince's operation had evaded the law for so long. "He's clever," Claire said, pointing to a map with several marked locations. "He moves frequently, uses shell businesses, and keeps his associates loyal through fear. But he made a mistake if he came after Shadow. It means he's desperate, and desperation makes people sloppy." Megan felt a chill as Claire described Vince's tactics, but determination burned brighter within her. "What do we need to do?" she asked. "We need a trail," Claire replied. "Something that ties Vince directly to the operation and proves he's still involved. Shadow might be the key to that. If Vince wants him back, it's because he's valuable to whatever's left of the ring." The plan they devised was risky but necessary. Using Claire's connections, they would leak word that Shadow was being moved to a new, undisclosed location, baiting Vince into making a move. The police, armed with Claire's evidence, would be ready to intercept him. As the day wore on, Megan couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Every step they took felt like walking a tightrope above a chasm. But she knew they had no other choice. Shadow had endured enough, and it was time to end the cycle of fear and violence. That evening, Megan sat with Shadow on the porch, the soft hum of crickets filling the air. She ran her fingers through his fur, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been so brave, Shadow. You've fought so hard. And now it's my turn to fight for you." Shadow tilted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers with a depth of understanding that brought tears to her eyes. She hugged him tightly, her resolve solidifying. Tomorrow would be a turning point. Not just for Shadow but for every dog that Vince had exploited and every life he had destroyed. The question that lingered in Megan's mind as the stars began to fade was one she couldn't answer yet. Would Vince take the bait? Or would he find a way to stay one step ahead? And if the confrontation came, would Shadow finally be free of the ghosts that had haunted him for so long? As dawn broke, the farmhouse stirred with quiet anticipation. The plan was in motion, but no one could predict how it would unfold or who might come out on top. The farmhouse was steeped in silence, broken only by the distant hum of a car engine. Megan stood by the window, her hand resting on Shadow's back, feeling the tension in his body ripple through her own. Ellie's voice was calm but firm as she announced, "It's him. Vince is here." The black car rolled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk before the engine sputtered to a stop. A heavy door creaked open, and Vince Callahan stepped out, his tall frame imposing against the backdrop of the fading light. He scanned the farmhouse with predatory precision, his eyes cold and calculating. Megan whispered to Shadow, her voice barely audible, "Stay with me, boy." "Not yet." Shadow's ears twitched, his muscles taut as he watched Vince's every move. Claire stepped out onto the porch, holding a folder of evidence in one hand, her expression unflinching. "Vince Callahan," she called out, her voice steady and commanding. "It's over. We've got the proof. And the police are on their way." Vince smirked, his movements slow and deliberate as he approached the porch. "You think a few papers and a sob story are going to stop me?" he sneered. His hand slipped into his jacket, pulling out a small crowbar, the steel glinting in the dim light. "I've dealt with people like you before. Now, give me the dog." Before Megan could react, Vince took a step toward the door. Shadow sprang forward, his bark exploding like a gunshot. Megan's command to stay caught in her throat as Shadow charged toward Vince, a blur of muscle and determination. Vince turned, startled by the sudden movement, and swung the crowbar just as Shadow lunged. The weapon grazed Shadow's side, but it did nothing to deter him. Shadow's jaws clamped onto Vince's arm, his growl a low, feral rumble that sent chills down Megan's spine. Vince howled in pain, dropping the crowbar as he struggled to shake the dog off. "Shadow, no!" Megan screamed, rushing forward, but she stopped short as Vince stumbled, Shadow's grip unyielding. The two figures tangled in a fierce struggle, Vince's attempts to shove Shadow away growing increasingly frantic. Vince managed to yank his arm free, but Shadow was relentless. The dog darted to the side, dodging a wild swing from Vince, before lunging again, this time going for Vince's leg. His powerful jaws clamped down, bringing the man crashing to the ground. Vince kicked out wildly, his boot connecting with Shadow's ribs, but the dog held his ground, refusing to let go. The sound of police sirens grew louder in the distance, but Vince was far from finished. Desperation flashed in his eyes as he scrambled toward the dropped crowbar, his fingers closing around the cold steel. Shadow moved faster, intercepting him with a ferocious snarl. He lunged again, this time pinning Vince to the ground, his teeth bared inches from the man's face. You think you can stop me? Vince spat, his voice a mixture of fury and fear. Shadow growled, the sound low and guttural, his breath hot against Vince's skin. For the first time, the predator looked genuinely afraid. Megan darted forward, grabbing the crowbar and tossing it out of Vince's reach. Stay down, she yelled, her voice trembling but firm. Shadow didn't move from his position, his weight pressing Vince into the dirt as the first police car skidded to a stop in the driveway. The officers stormed out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Freeze! Hands where we can see them. Vince didn't resist. He couldn't. Shadow's growl deepened as the officers approached, his protective instincts still in overdrive. Shadow! Enough! Megan called, her voice soft but commanding. The dog hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to Megan, before he finally stepped back, his body still tense and ready to act. The officers moved in quickly, cuffing Vince and hauling him to his feet. As Vince was led away, he shot a venomous glare at Megan and Shadow. This isn't over, he hissed, but the threat hung hollow in the air. Shadow stood beside Megan, his sides heaving but his posture strong and steady. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur. You did it, Shadow, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You saved us. The officers thanked Megan and Claire for their bravery, commending Shadow's role in subduing Vince. Claire handed over her folder of evidence, ensuring Vince's operation would be dismantled for good. As the police cars disappeared into the distance, Megan felt the weight of the moment settle over her. Shadow leaned into her side, his presence steady and reassuring. For the first time, Megan truly saw the transformation in his eyes, not just from fear to strength, but from survivor to protector. He had faced his past and triumphed, and together, they had ensured it would never haunt him again. Shadow's story is one of resilience, redemption, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, love and trust can transform lives. Shadow was given a second chance, and in return, he became the hero Megan didn't know she needed. Their journey is proof that no matter how broken the past may be, the future can hold hope and healing. If the story touched your heart, don't let it end here. On Tapestry of Worlds, we believe in sharing stories that inspire, connect, and remind us of the beauty in the world, whether through tales of courage, transformation, or the unbreakable bonds we share with those we love. Join us on this journey by hitting that subscribe button. Help us grow this community of dreamers and believers. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And let's continue weaving together the extraordinary tapestry of lives and worlds. One story at a time. Together, we can make a difference.